Judge sides with white cops in court until the black man reveals he's a U.S. attorney. The courtroom was a tomb. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as the crowd shifted in uneasy silence. The wooden benches groaned beneath the weight of bodies too tense to move. And at the front of it all, under the cold, indifferent glare of justice, stood Elijah Hayes, 16 years old, wrists bound in steel cuffs too tight for a child's skin. His breathing was shallow. His eyes darted across the room, searching for something, anything that made sense. But the courtroom offered none. Defendant Elijah Hayes is charged with aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer. The bailiff read, his voice robotic like he was reciting the weather. Case number 21-134, presiding, Judge Sharon Whitmore. The judge didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even look up from her files. She simply said, proceed. And just like that, a boy was on trial for his life. Elijah had no history of violence, no weapon, no prior record. What he did have was melanin in his skin and the nerve to ask a cop, "Why are you following me?" That was it. One question, one look. And now Elijah was facing years behind bars for lunging at an officer, a charge that had been rubber-stamped within hours of his arrest and fast-tracked through a system that never once asked if the story made sense. In the gallery, Malcolm Hayes sat frozen, his hands clenched so tight they'd gone pale at the knuckles. He wasn't a man easily shaken. He'd worked with the Justice Department for 20 years. But this wasn't work. This was his son. And he was watching him drown in a courtroom where no one was even pretending to care. The prosecutor was already on his feet, a young man in a crisp navy suit, eyes sharp, voice smoother than it should have been for the stakes involved. "Your Honor," he said with performative concern, "the state will show that the defendant behaved in an erratic and hostile manner, placing Officer Kevin Rourke in a position of imminent danger." There it was. Imminent danger. The phrase that let a man shoot, strike, or shackle a black teenager and still sleep soundly at night. Malcolm's jaw tightened. No video had been presented. No body cam footage. No civilian testimony. Just one officer's word, and it was enough. Elijah stood beside his public defender, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days and hadn't read the case file in 4. The man leaned toward Elijah, whispered something, and Elijah nodded, his lips trembling as he tried to swallow his fear. The courtroom had already made up its mind. Judge Whitmore finally looked up. Her gaze was glacier cold as it swept across the room, landing briefly on Elijah before flicking away, like even eye contact was too generous. "Does the defense have an opening statement?" she asked, with the same tone someone might use to order a coffee. The lawyer stood awkwardly. "Your Honor, my client," but he didn't get to finish. The prosecutor cut in. "Objection. Defense counsel is referencing material not yet entered into evidence." "Objection sustained," Whitmore snapped before the lawyer could even respond. Malcolm couldn't take it. He stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the hush like a thunderclap, "my son is 16. He asked why he was being followed. That's not a crime." Every head turned. Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Sir, if you speak again without permission, I will have you removed from this courtroom." Malcolm didn't back down. "This entire process is wrong. There's no evidence. No due process. You're treating him like he's already guilty." "Bailiff," she said. The word was a command. One of the guards moved toward Malcolm, heavy boots thudding like a threat across the polished floor. For a split second, time froze. You could feel the tension clinging to the air like smoke after an explosion. Malcolm raised his hands, not in surrender, but in warning. "I'm not here to start a scene," he said, his voice steady now, deep, thunderous. "But I will not sit quietly while you destroy my son for something he didn't do." He didn't shout, he didn't curse, but he was louder than anyone in the room. And that was the problem, because the courtroom wasn't built to hear voices like his. Not when they were calm, not when they were right, only when they were broken. The bailiff stopped inches away from him, waiting for a nod from the judge. It never came. She stared at Malcolm like she was daring him to go further, like she wanted him to explode so she could justify dismissing him altogether. Malcolm didn't move, didn't blink, He just sat back down, slowly, deliberately, eyes locked on his son. No one in that courtroom knew who he really was. They didn't know about the degrees, the federal courtroom victories, the policy memos with his name on the bottom. All they saw was a black man too angry, too loud, too close to the truth. The words dropped like a guillotine. 5 years in juvenile detention. The judge's voice was flat, unmoved, as if she'd just sentenced a number, not a child, not a life, not a 16-year-old boy whose only crime was existing while black in the wrong zip code. Elijah didn't move. He stood there, frozen, lips parted slightly like the air had just been knocked out of his chest. The cuffs on his wrists clinked softly as his hands trembled. His public defender blinked in disbelief, muttered something beneath his breath. Too little, too late. Malcolm Hayes rose halfway from his seat. His heart slammed against his rib cage like a war drum. "What did you just say?" he whispered, but the words were lost in the chaos unraveling around him. The bailiff moved toward Elijah. The gavel slammed once, twice, 3 times. "Order in the court!" There was no order. There was only outrage, only injustice, steaming and suffocating like smoke trapped under glass. Malcolm's voice finally tore through the room. "You're sentencing a child based on nothing. There was no weapon, no evidence. You don't even have video." Judge Whitmore didn't even look up. "Remove him." Bailiffs turned. Malcolm didn't care. He didn't back down. "This is a farce. A legal execution dressed in robes and polite language." Elijah looked at his father as the guards took his arm. His eyes were wide, panicked, pleading, not just for help, but for understanding, for someone to explain how the world flipped upside down in less than 10 minutes. "I didn't do anything," he said, voice cracking. "Dad, I swear, I just asked him why." "I know," Malcolm said, stepping forward before the guards could stop him. "I know, son. You did nothing wrong." His voice was soft now, but that softness carried more rage than a scream. The courtroom had already moved on. The judge was gathering her papers. The prosecutor was shaking hands with Officer Rourke, both of them smug, satisfied, like this was just another win. Just another black boy taken off the streets. Just another case closed. But it wasn't over. Not for Malcolm, not for Elijah. Because in that moment, standing in a courtroom where the scales of justice were rusted and rotting, Malcolm made a silent vow. They will regret this. The hallway smelled like bleach, sweat, and something sour that clung to the air like guilt. Cold white lights flickered overhead, humming above chipped linoleum floors that had seen too many broken promises and too many forgotten children. Each step Malcolm Hayes took echoed with dread. He hadn't worn a suit. Today, he wasn't a senior federal advisor. He wasn't a man who had drafted federal civil rights legislation or spoken before the Justice Committee in D.C. He was just a father, and his son was on the other side of the glass. The guard didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything. "We know who runs this place, and it's not you." Malcolm sat down at the steel chair in front of the reinforced partition. The cold surface sent a shiver through him, but it wasn't the metal. It was the silence that followed. Then a door opened across the glass, the clank of chains, the soft shuffle of shackled feet. And there he was, Elijah, his boy, 16, eyes sunken. A fresh bruise bloomed along his cheekbone, deep purple under fluorescent light. His lip was split. His posture, usually upright, proud, was collapsed, folded into himself like he didn't know where to hide. When he saw his father, he paused for just a moment, shame flickering in his gaze, before sitting down slowly. The phone receiver crackled as Malcolm picked it up. He watched Elijah hesitate, then lift his own. They sat in silence, just breathing for a moment. Then Elijah's voice came through, small, hoarse. "Dad," he whispered, "what did I do wrong?" The words hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he did. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said, swallowing the knot rising in his throat. "You asked a question. You used your voice. But they said I threatened him, that I charged at him." "Elijah," Malcolm's voice was firmer now. "You didn't. I know you. I know your heart. Elijah leaned forward, confusion etched deep into his young face. Then why am I here? Because you're black. Because the system is broken. Because power fears truth. And you didn't lower your eyes, but Malcolm didn't say that. Not yet. Instead, he said, because the world still doesn't know how to see you for who you are. Elijah looked down. They said I was aggressive, but I wasn't. I was scared. I know. His father's voice cracked. I know, son. They sat like that for a while, two figures divided by plexiglass and by a country that had promised liberty but delivered chains. Elijah told him about the guards, about the nights with the lights left on, about the food that made him sick, about the other boys, some older, some smaller, who kept to themselves or lashed out in fear. There were no second chances in here, no mercy, just time and the slow erosion of hope. I don't belong here, Elijah said, but I don't think anyone else does either. Malcolm wanted to scream. He wanted to tear through the glass and rip open the doors of this facility and drag every child out with his own hands. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not yet. I'm going to fix this, he said softly. Elijah looked up. How? Malcolm hesitated. Just trust me. They ended the visit when the guards gave the signal, cold and abrupt, like turning off a light. Elijah stood slowly. Don't forget about me, okay? Never, Malcolm said, watching him disappear through the metal door. The walk out of the facility was longer than the walk in, or maybe it just felt that way. He passed the same scuffed floors, the same tired guard behind the thick window, but now each detail felt carved into him. Outside, the night had fallen like a curtain. The wind was sharp, but Malcolm didn't go home right away. He sat in his car, staring into the darkness, breathing in silence, until the ache in his chest finally forced him to move. When he got home, the house was empty, too quiet. He walked through the rooms like a ghost. The kitchen lights glowed softly. A single photo of Elijah on the fridge, grinning, arms raised in victory after scoring a goal, mocked the horror of the day. Malcolm's hands shook as he poured himself a glass of water, but he couldn't drink it. The glass trembled in his grip. He set it down. He walked to his office, a small room, shelves lined with legal volumes, commendations on the walls, DOJ plaques, a framed copy of the Civil Rights Act annotated with his notes, his work, his life. He opened the drawer, and there it was, his badge, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Senior Legal Advisor. The emblem glinted under the desk lamp. He picked it up, held it in his hand. It felt heavier than it ever had, not because of the metal, but because of what it represented. Power, access, leverage, everything Elijah didn't have. He stared at it for a long time. He could end this tomorrow. He could walk into the courthouse, flash the badge, and turn the system inside out. But would that fix anything, or just make him the exception? He set the badge down, slowly, deliberately, because Malcolm Hayes had decided something far more dangerous than exposure. He would watch, he would wait, and he would document every lie, every injustice, every corner the system cut in trying to bury his son alive. Because this time, he wouldn't fight back as an officer of the law. He would fight back as a father who knew the system better than the men abusing it. He would let them believe they had won, and then, when the time was right, he would burn the entire thing down. Malcolm closed the drawer, sat back in his chair, and whispered to the empty room, "You started this. You're going to regret it." The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation, the kind that creeps under the skin and settles in the bones. Everything felt rehearsed, the shuffle of papers, the low murmur of the gallery, the mechanical clicking of the court reporter's keys. But for Malcolm Hayes, nothing about this was routine. His son's life was on the line, and everyone in that room acted like it was just another file on a crowded docket. Behind the elevated bench, Judge Sharon Whitmore adjusted her glasses, emotionless as always. She hadn't changed since the sentencing. Her gavel had condemned Elijah to 5 years in juvenile detention, with the same energy someone might use to read off a parking violation. And now she was back, stoic, dismissive, already leaning toward the prosecution before a single argument had been made. Malcolm sat in the second row, unmoving, unreadable, but fire churned beneath his calm exterior. And when he looked across the room and saw Daniel Mercer stand to address the court, that fire ignited into something colder, something sharper. Daniel, the man he once mentored, the intern he guided through his first federal hearing, now wearing a smug navy suit and a perfectly rehearsed smirk, he stood ready to bury the son of the very man who helped shape his career. Your Honor, Mercer began with the confidence of a man who knew the outcome before the jury had been selected. The state intends to show that the defendant, Elijah Hayes, acted with deliberate hostility toward a law enforcement officer. His behavior was not only confrontational, but dangerous. He turned to the jury with a dramatic pause, letting the phrase hang in the air like a loaded weapon. He was given multiple chances to de-escalate the situation. He chose instead to provoke and threaten a sworn officer. We ask this court to hold him accountable for those actions. Malcolm clenched his jaw. Lies dressed in courtroom polish. He could already see the direction Mercer was taking it. Frame the boy as aggressive, the officer as noble, and watch the jury nod along. It was a script that had played out for generations, and today it had a new cast. The prosecution calls Officer Kevin Rourke to the stand. The courtroom door opened, and Rourke entered with the swagger of a man who had nothing to fear and everything to gain. His uniform was spotless, his expression cool. He took the oath without flinching and settled into the witness seat like he owned it. Officer Rourke, Mercer began, can you describe your encounter with the defendant? Rourke nodded solemnly. I was on patrol near 9th and Lee, area known for illegal activity. That's when I spotted the defendant, pacing near a gas station, looked nervous, kept checking over his shoulder. And what did you do? I approached, asked him what he was doing. He got defensive right away, said, "Why are you following me?" His tone was aggressive. His posture was hostile. Did he make any threatening moves? Rourke's voice hardened. He stepped toward me, quickly, reached into his pocket. I had no idea what he was grabbing. And how did you respond? I restrained him, used approved tactics. No excessive force. Every word was polished, practiced, false, and every nod from Mercer only cemented the illusion further. Malcolm gripped the bench in front of him, knuckles pale. He wanted to shout, to stand, to remind the room who Rourke really was, a man caught in 3 misconduct reports, all buried in internal reviews. But this wasn't his moment, not yet. Was a weapon found? Mercer asked, already knowing the answer. No, Rourke admitted. Turned out to be his phone. But I couldn't take that risk. The jury barely reacted, as if pulling a phone was justification enough to slam a teenager to the pavement. Judge Whitmore didn't blink. She scribbled something in her notepad without looking up. Thank you, officer, Mercer said smoothly. No further questions. Rourke stepped down like a war hero returning from battle. Malcolm's stomach twisted. The lie had landed. The jury believed it. He could see it in their eyes. Acceptance, quiet agreement, maybe even relief. The story made sense to them. Young black male, nervous, reaching into a pocket. Must have been up to no good. The public defender, Wallace, rose from his seat. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted a page from his notes. Your Honor, the defense would like to call attention to the inconsistencies in the officer's statement. Objection, Mercer interrupted immediately. The defense is attempting to reframe sworn testimony without presenting new evidence. Sustained, Judge Whitmore replied before Wallace could finish his sentence. Malcolm blinked slowly. The air grew colder. Wallace tried again. We respectfully request to view surveillance footage from the gas station. Objection. This request was not filed in pretrial discovery. Sustained. Wallace's voice cracked. Your Honor, this is critical to our case. There's a chance this footage could show that my client... The objection is sustained, Whitmore repeated, eyes narrowing. Another blow. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. Watching his son's case be dismantled, one objection at a time, Wallace shuffled through his notes in desperation. Then, Your Honor, we'd like to submit a character letter from Elijah's principal. Objection. On what grounds? Wallace dared to ask. Mercer didn't flinch. Relevance. Whitmore's reply was immediate. Sustained. Malcolm's fingers twitched on the bench. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. They weren't just ignoring the defense. They were erasing it. Every question, every motion, every attempt at balance was met with Mercer's arrogant voice and Whitmore's approving nod. Wallace stood frozen, eyes scanning his remaining notes like he was searching for a miracle. But there was nothing, just silence. I have nothing further, Wallace said quietly. Judge Whitmore leaned back. Very well, then we'll proceed. And that's when Malcolm stood up. The sound of his chair scraping back echoed across the courtroom like a gunshot. Every head turned. Whitmore blinked in irritation. Sir, if you don't remain seated, I'll have the bailiff escort you. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply held up a thick folder in his hand, a manila document with the seal of the United States Department of Justice burned into the cover. Your Honor, he said calmly, voice resonant with quiet power, before you proceed, I think it's important to inform this court that I am the author of the federal policy your courtroom is currently violating. Dead silence. Judge Whitmore's mouth froze mid-command. Mercer stopped writing. The jury shifted. Malcolm took one step forward. This isn't just a case about a boy being misjudged. It's about a system collapsing under its own corruption. And I've spent the last 20 years drafting the safeguards that are meant to stop it. Whitmore narrowed her eyes. You are not counsel in this case, and I strongly advise you. I'm not here as counsel, Malcolm said, voice rising now. I'm here as a father and a federal legal advisor, Senior Civil Rights Division, Department of Justice, badge number 720-89H, and I'm watching you violate federal rights in real time. For a full 3 seconds, the entire courtroom seemed to forget how to breathe. Malcolm Hayes stood dead center in the aisle, spine straight, eyes locked onto Judge Sharon Whitmore. In his hand was a small leather wallet, plain, unassuming, until he flipped it open and raised it for everyone to see. The golden badge inside gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights. Beneath it, the laminated ID read, Malcolm Hayes, Senior Legal Advisor, Civil Rights Division, United States Department of Justice. The air evaporated from the room. The bailiff, halfway through stepping forward to remove him, froze mid-motion. The clerk stopped typing. Even the jurors, stone-faced and disinterested until now, sat up straight. Only one person spoke, and his voice dropped like a bomb. I am not just Elijah Hayes' father, Malcolm said, voice unwavering, low and thunderous. I am a senior legal advisor for the United States Department of Justice, and I have spent the last 2 decades crafting, reviewing, and enforcing the very civil rights policies this courtroom has trampled on. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Judge Whitmore stiffened behind the bench, her fingers curling slowly around her gavel. But she didn't strike it. Not yet. Mercer, formerly the most composed man in the room, went ghost pale. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He had no rebuttal prepared for this, because how could he? His former mentor had just turned the entire case on its head with 10 words. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence now swallowed the room whole. I watched, he continued, voice calm but heavy with rage, as my son was silenced, misrepresented, and discarded by a courtroom that had already made up its mind. I listened to a prosecutor twist facts, watched a police officer lie under oath, and observed a judge who refused to question anything that didn't fit the narrative she'd already chosen. He paused, letting the words hit like bullets. And I stayed silent because I needed to see for myself how deep the rot runs. Now Whitmore's hand trembled ever so slightly on the bench. She tried to compose herself. Mr. Hayes, this is highly irregular. What's irregular, Malcolm interrupted, voice rising, is a courtroom where objections are sustained before arguments are even made, where a child is branded a criminal without evidence, where a judge ignores legal procedure to protect a performance, not justice. No one dared interrupt him. I helped write the national standards for body camera requirements. I wrote the Department of Justice's guidance on the treatment of minors during arrest, and I helped author the very protocols that require transparency, not convenience. He took one step forward, measured, unstoppable. If this courtroom continues down this path, you're not just looking at a bad verdict. You're looking at a federal investigation. The room collapsed into silence again, a heavy, suffocating stillness. Even Elijah stared at his father like he was seeing him for the first time. The man who raised him with patience and quiet dignity was now a force of law. Malcolm's badge still glinted in the light. He slowly lowered it. I tried to let this system work. I tried to be a father in the back row, but you forced me to be something else. Judge Whitmore didn't speak. Mercer didn't move. The courtroom had lost control, and everyone knew it. Malcolm returned to his seat, slowly, calmly, like a man who had just detonated a bomb and was now waiting for the dust to settle. He folded his hands, and this time no one dared stop him. The silence in the courtroom had gone from stunned to suffocating. Every pair of eyes was locked on Malcolm Hayes, who stood not as a grieving father now, but as something much more dangerous. A man with knowledge, with power, and now, with evidence. He placed a thick black binder on the prosecution's table with a thud that echoed across the room like a hammer strike. Daniel Mercer flinched. Even Judge Whitmore tilted slightly forward, suddenly unsure whether she was still in control of the room. Malcolm looked directly at her. With the court's indulgence, he said coldly, I'd like to submit new evidence, previously withheld by the prosecution. Mercer stood too quickly, voice cracking. Your Honor, we object. This is improper procedure. But Malcolm cut him off, his voice slicing clean through Mercer's panic. Improper? The only thing improper is the prosecution's decision to hide these documents from discovery. He opened the binder and pulled out the first document, a complaint form. Exhibit A, an internal affairs report filed against Officer Kevin Rourke by a 16-year-old boy in 2021. The charges, excessive force, intimidation, verbal threats. He tossed the copy onto the judge's bench. The courtroom gasped. Malcolm continued, calm and devastating. The complaint was buried after a lack of evidence was cited. The only problem? It was never investigated. No statements taken. No review board convened. The file was marked closed less than 24 hours after it was filed. Judge Whitmore shifted. Mr. Hayes. But Malcolm wasn't done. He held up another folder. Exhibit B, an eerily similar report. Different name, different kid, same officer, same language, same outcome. He looked over at Rourke, who now sat stiffly, jaw clenched, face pale. Tell me, officer, how many complaints does it take before a pattern becomes a fact? Mercer tried again. Your Honor, these files were never... Malcolm turned sharply, his voice rising now. You didn't submit them because you knew. You had them, Daniel. You saw the names. You saw the reports. And instead of raising concerns, you buried them. Then with surgical precision, Malcolm lifted one more file, the final nail. Exhibit C, an internal email chain between Assistant District Attorney Daniel Mercer and his staff, dated 1 week before this trial. Subject line, clean up before court. He walked it up to the bench and handed it directly to Judge Whitmore. Scroll to page 2, he said. The judge did. Her eyes scanned the text, and for the first time since this trial began, her face changed. The mask cracked. The gavel in her hand trembled slightly. Read it aloud, Malcolm said. She didn't move, so he did it for her. He turned to the jury. Quote, let's make sure there are no surprises with Rourke's record. Flag anything that could cause a scene. The last thing we need is this kid's dad turning this into a circus. The courtroom exploded with murmurs. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward. Phones buzzed to life. Even the bailiff's composure faltered. Malcolm's voice dropped to a growl. You knew exactly who I was, Daniel. You just hoped I wouldn't speak. Mercer's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Malcolm paced now, calm and deliberate. I spent my career writing the rules to prevent things like this. I helped craft federal oversight protocols so that prosecutors couldn't manipulate trials and officers couldn't fabricate threats. He turned back toward the judge. And yet, here we are. Judge Whitmore swallowed hard, her words suddenly slow and cautious. These are serious accusations. They're more than accusations, Malcolm replied, fire in his voice. They're facts, documented, time-stamped, unredacted, and admissible. He gestured to Elijah, who sat still, stunned, watching his father become the shield he never thought he had. This isn't just about my son. It's about every name that never made it into this room. Every kid who didn't have a lawyer, or a father, or a badge to protect them. He looked back at the jury. Think about how close you came to sending an innocent boy away, based on a lie. The room was no longer a courtroom. It was a powder keg. Mercer slumped back into his seat, defeated. Rourke looked like he was trying to disappear into the floor. Whitmore sat frozen, knowing that every decision she made from this point forward would be watched, not just by the people in that room, but by a nation. Because Malcolm Hayes wasn't just a witness anymore. He was the embodiment of the law. He had written it, and now he was wielding it. The gavel hadn't fallen yet, but the weight in the air said everything had already changed. Malcolm stepped back, calm and silent once again, but the silence now belonged to him. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. By sunrise, the fire had already spread. It started as a clip, 34 seconds long, filmed on a shaky phone camera by a freelance journalist sitting in the back row of the courtroom. The moment Malcolm Hayes stood, raised his DOJ badge, and declared that the system had just violated the very laws he helped write. The caption was simple: DOJ senior legal advisor exposes corruption in son's trial, must watch. Within hours, it wasn't just being watched, it was being dissected, reposted, analyzed frame by frame. By noon, the clip had over 2 million views. By evening, it had gone global. News anchors called it an unprecedented courtroom intervention. Legal scholars called it a constitutional reckoning. But for the people who had lived it, for the communities who had been bruised, silenced, and forgotten, it was something else entirely. It was a call to war. Outside the East Baton Rouge courthouse, the sidewalk flooded with protesters before the first light turned green. Signs shot up like swords. Justice for Elijah, end the pipeline. We are all Elijah Hayes. Some were handwritten. Others were printed by the hundreds. Chants rang out, rhythmic and rising. No justice, no peace. Black lives, black laws, black power. Malcolm didn't lie. Whitmore must resign. Local reporters struggled to keep up, but by mid-afternoon, the media circus had swelled beyond control. CNN rolled live coverage from the courthouse steps. MSNBC aired a 3-part legal breakdown of the case, led by 2 former DOJ attorneys, both of whom openly condemned the trial's blatant constitutional violations. Fox News aired it too, though their coverage focused less on justice and more on an escalating federal overreach into local authority. But no one could deny the storm. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about what Elijah represented. The federal agents arrived like thunderclouds. No press conference, no warning, just unmarked vehicles, stern faces, and black DOJ jackets pouring into the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse before sunrise. By 7 a.m., the building was surrounded. Staffers were escorted out. Files were seized. Computer hard drives removed. Phones confiscated. The Department of Justice had launched its full-scale investigation. Judge Whitmore's chambers were the first to be locked down. Her office lights were still off when the knock came. By the time she opened the door in her robe, she was already no longer in charge. "We have a federal order," the lead agent said, holding up a document with the department seal. "Step aside." Outside, a crowd had already gathered. Reporters jostled for space. Protesters lined the steps with banners that read, "Let the system collapse, and we stand with Elijah." Microphones pointed at the courthouse like weapons. And at the center of it all stood Malcolm Hayes, calm, focused, and carrying a single briefcase. He stepped up to the podium. No notes, no speech, just the truth, sharp and ready. "Thank you for coming," he said. "There's more you need to see." He opened the briefcase and lifted out a hard drive, a folder, and a stack of printed transcripts. These are the things that weren't supposed to surface, evidence that was withheld, records that were sealed, complaints that were lost, all of it collected, verified, and cross-checked by independent counsel. He handed the materials to the federal officials beside him. Cameras zoomed in as the lead investigator flipped through a report marked confidential, suppressed files. Let me walk you through just a few of them. Malcolm pulled a small remote from his pocket. A projector behind him flickered on, casting a grainy video onto a mobile screen. In this footage, Malcolm narrated, you'll see Officer Kevin Rourke during a 2021 arrest of another black teenager. 16, no weapon, same location. The body cam was mysteriously missing during trial, but the gas station security camera caught it. The video played. The crowd gasped. Rourke was shown slamming a teen into a patrol car. No resistance, just brutality. And here, Malcolm switched the feed. A 2022 audio recording from a public defender's office line. The voice is Daniel Mercer's, talking about which records to withhold so the jury doesn't get confused by the history. Gasps turned to shouting. Reporters scrambled to update their live streams. This, Malcolm continued, holding up a dusty folder, is the original complaint filed against Judge Sharon Whitmore in 2019. A case where a defense attorney alleged racially biased sentencing. It was buried in an internal memo. No action was taken. By now you could hear a pin drop. Malcolm looked over the crowd, the courthouse, the agents, the flashing cameras, and he saw it. The system unraveling. A journalist in the front row finally broke the silence. Mr. Hayes, she called out, breathless, why didn't you reveal who you were from the start? Why didn't you say you worked for the Department of Justice? Every mic turned toward him. Malcolm paused, then looked directly into the camera and said without blinking, because I wanted to see how far they'd go. I wanted to know how they would treat my son if he didn't come with a name. Gasps, silence, then applause. He continued, voice low but ringing with fury. I wanted to feel what every black parent in this country feels when they walk into a courtroom knowing the system sees their child as guilty before a word is spoken. And what I found was worse than I expected. It wasn't just neglect. It was orchestration. He leaned into the mic. I watched a courtroom bend truth to protect power. I watched a prosecutor I mentored twist evidence. I watched the judge nod through every lie like justice was optional. The emotion in his voice sharpened with every word. But now, he said, raising the final folder, we turn the lights on. Inside the courthouse, the investigation was in full swing. Federal agents pulled transcripts, combed through sentencing records, and isolated hundreds of flagged cases, all under Judge Whitmore's tenure. By noon, 3 more attorneys came forward with similar stories. Civil rights organizations began collecting testimony. Elijah's story had opened a floodgate, and the water wasn't going to stop. Malcolm stayed outside. Reporters followed him as he walked down the courthouse steps with calm dignity. Elijah was now beside him, free, quiet, still absorbing everything. Protesters made a path for them. People applauded. Some cried. But Malcolm's face was steel. This wasn't over. He turned to Elijah. You okay? Elijah nodded, voice low. Why didn't you tell me who you really were? Malcolm looked at his son, eyes full of both sorrow and fire. Because I needed to see if the law I believed in would still protect you, even when I didn't stand behind it. Elijah swallowed. And it didn't. No, Malcolm said. It didn't. He looked back at the courthouse, now surrounded by federal agents and flashing cameras. But it will now. The courthouse stood under a heavy sky, dark clouds churning restlessly overhead, mirroring the storm that had enveloped the city. After weeks of media frenzy, federal investigations, and nationwide outrage, the decision had finally come down. The case of Elijah Hayes was officially reopened. A second chance at justice, rarely granted yet impossible to deny after Malcolm Hayes tore the veil from the system's face. This wasn't just about one trial anymore. It was about confronting a rotten core, the silent injustices hidden behind polished oak and brass gavels. Elijah stepped out of the black sedan beside his father, Malcolm, dressed sharply in a tailored dark suit and tie. Gone was the frightened boy forced into a defendant's jumpsuit. Today, Elijah walked like a man who knew exactly who stood at his side and exactly what they faced. They moved past reporters, camera flashes snapping rapidly. Voices shouted from the crowd, but Malcolm kept his gaze forward, his hand lightly on Elijah's shoulder. The courthouse doors swung open, and father and son stepped into the very heart of the storm. Inside courtroom 3, Judge Whitmore had been replaced. In her seat sat Judge Angela Kendrick, flown in from Washington, impartial, professional, utterly untouched by the local political games. Cameras from major news outlets lined the back walls, their red lights blinking silently, capturing every breath, every heartbeat. Malcolm didn't sit at the back this time. He stood at the defense table, files stacked neatly, each piece of paper as sharp as a dagger. Officer Kevin Rourke sat stiffly in the witness chair, uniform pristine, but his composure clearly frayed. Across from Malcolm, the prosecution table was empty of Daniel Mercer, his career now a casualty of his own dishonesty. Malcolm turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Rourke's with laser intensity. The room went utterly silent as Malcolm stepped forward to begin his cross-examination. "Officer Rourke," Malcolm started calmly, his voice low, yet cutting through the heavy air. "Can you repeat to this court, clearly and precisely, what justification you gave for arresting my son?" Rourke shifted uncomfortably, his eyes briefly flickering around the courtroom before settling back on Malcolm. He cleared his throat. I felt threatened." Malcolm paused, letting the silence sharpen into discomfort. "Threatened?" he repeated slowly. "Did Elijah threaten you verbally?" "No." "Did he have a weapon?" "No." "Did he raise his hands to attack?" Rourke hesitated. "Not exactly." Malcolm cut him off sharply. "Answer clearly, officer. Did he physically attack you or raise his hands in aggression?" "No," Rourke admitted, almost whispering now. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. "Then, Officer Rourke, please explain to me, and to this court, exactly what my son did that made you feel threatened enough to violently arrest him?" Rourke's fingers clenched the arms of the witness chair. He avoided Malcolm's eyes. His confidence, once ironclad, was eroding rapidly under the intensity of Malcolm's relentless questioning. "I believed he posed a risk." Rourke stumbled through his response, but his voice cracked, betraying uncertainty. "A risk?" Malcolm's voice hardened like steel. "Based on what evidence?" Silence echoed. Malcolm pressed harder. "Answer me. Was it his words? His actions? What exactly did Elijah Hayes do?" Rourke shifted again, his face reddening, sweat breaking across his brow. "It wasn't exactly what he did, it was what, officer?" Rourke's voice faltered. "It was how he looked at me." The courtroom froze, the silence turning heavy, almost unbearable. Even the reporters stopped writing. Malcolm let the words hover. "How he looked at you?" Malcolm repeated, the disbelief in his voice palpable. "Clarify, officer." Rourke's breathing became visibly erratic, a sheen of sweat glistening across his forehead. He looked at me like he was defiant, like I was nothing." Malcolm's voice went dangerously quiet. "So let me get this straight. You violently arrested my 16-year-old son, charged him falsely, took away months of his life, simply because you didn't like the way he looked at you?" Rourke didn't respond. Malcolm stepped even closer, eyes blazing. "Officer Rourke, do you understand the gravity of what you just said? Do you understand the level of abuse and injustice hidden behind that statement?" Rourke looked down, defeated. I didn't like the way he stared. It made me uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" Malcolm's voice was lethal, each syllable carefully weighted. "Because a young black boy looked you in the eye?" The courtroom murmured loudly. Cameras flashed urgently. Judge Kendrick leaned forward, but didn't interrupt, her own eyes wide with shock. "Tell me, officer," Malcolm continued fiercely, "how many other children have you arrested because you didn't like the way they looked at you? How many lives have you ruined with your discomfort?" Rourke had no answer. He sat speechless, a man stripped bare before the world. Malcolm turned slowly, addressing the jury directly. "Members of the jury, My son lost his freedom, his dignity, and nearly lost his future, all because this officer didn't like his gaze. Elijah's real crime? Refusing to lower his eyes, refusing to surrender his dignity, refusing to be invisible. The words resonated through the courtroom, vibrating with bitter truth. Malcolm glanced back at Elijah, who sat tall, his gaze steady, eyes unafraid. A young man who had survived being crushed beneath the weight of prejudice, now standing unbowed, defiant, and proud. Turning once more to Rourke, Malcolm's voice turned ice cold, cutting through the silence like a blade. Officer Rourke, in this courtroom today, the only threat revealed is you, your badge, your authority, your prejudice. A man with power who abused it simply because he could. Rourke remained silent, utterly exposed. Judge Kendrick finally leaned into her microphone, breaking the silence gently yet firmly. Mr. Hayes, any further questions? Malcolm stepped back, taking a slow breath. No further questions, Your Honor. He returned to Elijah's side, placing a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. Elijah looked up at him, a hint of gratitude and pride shining in his eyes. The jury shifted uncomfortably, processing the damning truth laid bare. In the gallery, reporters hurriedly typed, capturing the explosive testimony, sending headlines across the globe. Officer admits, arrested DOJ advisor's son for how he looked at me. Trial revelation, justice blinded by a stare. The city, no, the nation was watching. Millions saw firsthand how fragile justice could be when balanced on prejudice and power. Malcolm squeezed Elijah's shoulder softly, speaking low enough only he could hear. You've done enough, son. Let justice do the rest. Elijah nodded silently, a quiet strength settling into his features. Judge Kendrick paused carefully before addressing the jury, her voice resonating with authority and weight. Ladies and gentlemen, today you have witnessed a profound injustice exposed. Consider carefully what you've heard. The foundation of this court, and every court, is fairness, evidence, and truth. Not fear, not bias, certainly not prejudice. She paused, scanning each face slowly. Justice delayed can no longer be justice denied. Malcolm sat beside Elijah, heart heavy yet lighter than it had been in months. The courtroom, once a stage for corruption and silence, now belonged to the truth, and the truth had spoken louder than any prejudice ever could. Elijah, once reduced to a mere prisoner, sat tall. His quiet dignity had spoken volumes, and in that moment, Malcolm knew that justice, real justice, was finally within reach. Because today, the truth had not blinked. Today, the truth had stared injustice squarely in the eye, and injustice had looked away first. For Malcolm Hayes, for Elijah, for everyone watching, this was not just another day in court. This was a reckoning. The courtroom was utterly silent, the air heavy with anticipation, charged with a kind of raw electricity that only justice delayed could generate. Reporters leaned forward, cameras aimed, fingers poised above keyboards, ready to capture every nuance of the moment. Elijah Hayes sat tall beside his father, Malcolm, both men unflinching beneath the weight of countless eyes. Judge Kendrick adjusted her reading glasses slowly, eyes calm yet focused, the gravity of the decision evident in every line on her face. She glanced briefly toward Officer Rourke, whose head remained bowed in shame and defeat, then back toward Elijah, whose gaze held steady, a testament to courage forged from injustice. The judge took a slow breath, the room tensed, and then her voice echoed clearly, calmly yet powerfully. Having thoroughly reviewed all evidence, testimonies, and investigative reports presented by both sides, this court finds no credible grounds for the charges against Elijah Hayes. Effective immediately, all charges are dismissed, and the record will reflect his complete and unconditional exoneration. The courtroom erupted. A roar surged upward, a tidal wave of emotion. Relief, joy, and vindication mingled as one. People stood from their seats, clapping, cheering, shouting Elijah's name as cameras flashed, reporters jostling to broadcast the news instantaneously to millions around the world. Outside the courthouse, thousands gathered around televisions and live streams, their collective voices swelling into a chorus of justice reclaimed. It was more than celebration, it was defiance, a reclaiming of the dignity stolen from so many others who never made headlines, whose lives slipped through the cracks of the same broken system Elijah had barely survived. Yet amid the jubilation, one man remained silent, unmoving. Malcolm Hayes sat still, his jaw tense, hands folded tightly on the table before him, eyes narrowed not in anger, but in profound reflection. His silence was louder than any cheer, heavier than any verdict. He was not smiling. He was not celebrating. His quiet presence, a steady force that had brought the courtroom to its knees, now exuded something deeper, a wisdom that victory in one case was merely a drop in an ocean filled with thousands of invisible injustices. Judge Kendrick tapped her gavel, gradually restoring silence. She leaned forward slightly, eyes filled with respect and sincerity. Elijah Hayes, this court apologizes deeply for the injustice you have endured. You are free to go. Elijah slowly rose, turning toward his father. The young man's eyes were bright, yet he saw something in Malcolm's face, a truth deeper than relief. Malcolm stood too, but his expression remained severe, intense. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed rapidly, but Malcolm raised one hand calmly, waiting until the chaos simmered down. Finally, when silence was restored, Malcolm spoke. His voice was deep, unwavering, and carried the weight of every injustice he'd witnessed. Today, we witnessed the law finally doing what it was always meant to do. We've seen a wrong corrected. My son Elijah is innocent, but we must understand this clearly. One trial, one verdict, one moment of justice does not erase the thousands of wrongful convictions still out there. His voice sharpened, each word delivered with calculated precision. My son's innocence has been restored. But what about those who don't have fathers working in the Department of Justice? What about the countless young men and women whose innocence is buried beneath procedural errors, hidden evidence, and systemic prejudice? Who speaks for them? The cheering had faded completely now, replaced by heavy silence. Every camera lens focused intently on Malcolm's face, his words reverberating far beyond the courtroom walls. He took a step forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Elijah, his eyes blazing with righteous determination. I am proud of my son, of his courage, his strength, but I refuse to celebrate today as a complete victory, because until every wrongful conviction is reversed, until every courtroom sees truth instead of prejudice, our work, my work, is not finished. His gaze swept slowly around the room, meeting every pair of eyes directly. His voice became softer, yet no less powerful. This case, my son's case, is not unique. Elijah is fortunate. His injustice was visible, documented, fought for. But what about the invisible? Those who suffer silently without voices to advocate for them. Today, let Elijah Hayes stand not just as a symbol of personal triumph, but as a call to action. Malcolm raised his hand, gesturing toward the reporters. You, the media, have power. Do not forget this story tomorrow, next week, or next year. Do not reduce it to headlines or sound bites. Let Elijah's victory serve as a challenge, a reminder to dig deeper, to expose hidden truths, to fight harder against injustice wherever it lives. Malcolm turned to Elijah briefly, placing a steady hand on his son's shoulder. Elijah's eyes shimmered, pride mingling with the realization of the weight he now carried. Malcolm's voice grew softer yet sharper, the edge cutting clearly through the silence. I want each person listening today to think about those who do not have the privilege of public outrage, who do not have their stories told. Elijah was lucky because his father had a voice. But true justice cannot depend on luck, family connections, or media attention. He stepped closer to the reporters, eyes blazing with conviction. Justice must become routine, ordinary, expected, not a rare event worthy of cheering. It is our collective responsibility to demand accountability, not just today, but every day. Malcolm stepped back, breathing deeply, the weight of the moment pressing upon him visibly. His voice quieted again, filled now with deep, resonating empathy. For my son Elijah, today means freedom. But we must never confuse one individual's freedom with systemic change. This fight is only beginning. For every Elijah, there are thousands more. waiting silently in prisons, cells, and juvenile centers across this nation, praying that someone sees them as worthy of justice. He looked once more around the packed courtroom, holding the collective breath of the nation. I will not rest until that justice, real justice, is delivered to every one of them. Malcolm stepped back, pulling Elijah close, holding him firmly by the shoulder. For a moment, father and son stood there silently, an unbreakable unity forged through hardship, injustice, and the unyielding fight for truth. Then slowly Malcolm guided Elijah toward the doors, leaving the courtroom in profound, thoughtful silence. A silence heavier, more meaningful than any cheers or applause. As they exited, reporters began quietly murmuring among themselves, the magnitude of Malcolm's words settling over them like a heavy cloak. Headlines quickly formed, not of shallow triumph, but of renewed responsibility. Elijah freed, but Malcolm Hayes warns. Justice still out of reach. A father's powerful message. My son's victory means nothing if others remain unseen. Stepping out into daylight, father and son faced a crowd waiting eagerly. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, yet Malcolm walked calmly past, arm firmly around Elijah's shoulder, unbothered by their questions. Because today wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning. Malcolm knew this courtroom victory was a small step, a necessary one, but far from enough. He had made a promise, a commitment not just to his son, but to thousands of sons and daughters who still waited, still suffered. Their faces were with him now, engraved deeply within his mind. And as he walked forward, holding Elijah close, Malcolm Hayes silently vowed again, today we fight, but tomorrow we keep fighting, until justice becomes ordinary, until justice becomes expected, until justice truly applies equally to everyone. The verdict echoed far beyond courtroom walls, reverberating through streets, offices, and neighborhoods, shaking the foundations of a justice system long overdue for scrutiny. Elijah Hayes walked free, but the ripples of his ordeal would reshape an entire nation. Within days, the machinery of federal justice began to move with a newfound sense of urgency. Washington, D.C. became a hive of activity. Phones rang incessantly, offices stayed lit through the night, and sealed files spilled their secrets under the careful eyes of DOJ investigators. This wasn't a mere symbolic gesture. It was a reckoning, a cleansing storm rolling relentlessly toward anyone who had profited from injustice. At precisely 7 a.m. on a brisk Tuesday morning, FBI agents escorted Officer Kevin Rourke from his home, in full view of stunned neighbors. Rourke had spent years shielded by a uniform that demanded blind respect. Now, stripped of badge and authority, he was nothing more than another disgraced figure awaiting judgment. Cameras flashed furiously as Rourke moved silently through the press gauntlet, head lowered, eyes avoiding the relentless gaze of a society finally holding him accountable. Reporters shouted questions, but he uttered no words. His silence was deafening, heavy with shame and defeat. The once proud officer who had arrested Elijah simply because he disliked the defiant look in his eyes was now publicly suspended, awaiting a full criminal investigation. Across town, the consequences for Daniel Mercer were unfolding even more dramatically. The ambitious prosecutor who had carefully built his career on a foundation of half-truths and strategic silence was now cornered, trapped by the very lies he had sown. A dozen federal agents in dark suits poured into Mercer's office, carrying subpoenas and warrants. Boxes of documents, hidden emails, and encrypted digital communications were systematically unearthed, cataloged, and scrutinized under glaring fluorescent lights. Mercer himself sat motionless, eyes empty, face pale, watching helplessly as his legacy disintegrated page by incriminating page. Federal agents moved around him like shadows, dismantling a career built on deception. When asked by an investigator why he'd withheld critical evidence, Mercer offered only one broken whisper. I thought nobody would ever find out. But justice had finally turned its harsh spotlight upon him, illuminating every hidden truth. Mercer's words hung limply in the air, meaningless now in the face of accountability. Outside, the media's attention remained unwavering. Headlines screamed from every direction, capturing the full extent of the crisis, shaking the local judicial establishment. DOJ takes action, Officer suspended, prosecutor under federal investigation. Malcolm Hayes watched it all with grim satisfaction. Not joy, not vengeance, but the quiet knowledge that justice, though painfully delayed, had finally arrived. Yet Malcolm was not content simply to watch from afar. He understood clearly that one verdict, one investigation, even one prosecution, was merely scratching the surface. True change demanded sustained action, and Malcolm knew precisely where to begin. In the aftermath of Elijah's trial, Malcolm resigned his senior advisory position at the DOJ, a decision met initially with shock and confusion from colleagues who could not imagine the Civil Rights Division without him. But Malcolm was clear. "My fight is no longer behind a desk in Washington," he declared resolutely during his final meeting. "My place is out there, on the ground, protecting those who cannot protect themselves." With steely determination, Malcolm turned his formidable energies to a new mission, one born from personal pain and fueled by profound conviction. Within weeks, he officially announced the creation of a groundbreaking advocacy organization, aptly named Eyes Open, Justice for Black Youth. The name resonated deeply, a tribute to Elijah's fierce, unyielding gaze that had ignited Officer Rourke's prejudice, and symbolizing Malcolm's pledge that no child would ever again suffer simply because someone disliked the look in their eyes. Eyes Open quickly gained momentum, mobilizing a diverse coalition of civil rights attorneys, former federal prosecutors, social activists, and thousands of families who had silently suffered beneath the weight of systemic injustice. Malcolm didn't merely gather support, he rallied warriors, men and women hardened by adversity, ready to dismantle decades of racial bias hiding beneath polished oak courtrooms and carefully worded verdicts. The headquarters of Eyes Open became a relentless engine of activity. Volunteers tirelessly analyzing wrongful arrest reports, dedicated attorneys reviewing closed case files, and social workers reaching out to families shattered by unjust imprisonment. Malcolm led every meeting personally, speaking quietly yet fiercely, never losing sight of the mission. "This isn't charity," he declared emphatically at the inaugural meeting, his voice echoing powerfully through the packed hall. "This is obligation. This is our chance to fight for those who the system ignores, silences, and discards. Our children must no longer face the courtroom alone." News spread quickly. Celebrities, philanthropists, and activists pledged their support, eager to join a movement rooted in undeniable truth and relentless determination. Malcolm soon stood shoulder to shoulder with influential allies, their collective presence impossible to ignore. But his most powerful ally remained Elijah, who had become an emblem of resilience and justice. Standing beside Malcolm at every rally, press conference, and community meeting, Elijah's presence spoke louder than words ever could. His steady eyes, once viewed as defiant and dangerous, now inspired crowds to believe real change was possible. The movement grew rapidly. Local governments began reform initiatives to rebuild trust, hastily revising protocols on body cameras, accountability, and transparency. Legislation started appearing in state houses across the nation, each bill directly influenced by Malcolm's relentless advocacy. But despite these victories, Malcolm never relaxed his vigilance. Every day brought new challenges, new threats, and reminders of how deeply prejudice remained entrenched within powerful institutions. Yet he pressed forward, unyielding, refusing to declare victory prematurely. Months after the trial, Malcolm stood at a massive rally held outside the courthouse, where Elijah's nightmare had begun. Thousands gathered, chanting slogans of defiance and hope. Banners waved, signs bearing Elijah's name held high, symbols now of collective strength. Malcolm stepped confidently to the microphone, Elijah standing proudly beside him. The crowd roared approval, voices blending into a single powerful cry for lasting justice. When the cheering faded, Malcolm spoke clearly, deliberately, the strength in his voice matched by quiet urgency. "My son is free today because our fight became public, but our work is far from done. Tonight, as we gather here, countless Elijahs still sit behind bars, voiceless, forgotten, abandoned by a system that sees only their skin and not their innocence." He paused, the weight of every unjustly imprisoned child clearly etched in his expression. We must never rest, never be satisfied, never declare victory until every child's dignity is restored, until every officer, prosecutor, and judge understands clearly that power demands responsibility. Malcolm's voice rose, filled with passion and unshakable resolve. Eyes Open exists not just to protect Black youth, but to remind our justice system that accountability must be blind to color, class, or convenience. We will no longer remain silent. We will no longer lower our eyes, because every child deserves the right to look justice squarely in the face, without fear. Cheers erupted once again, shaking the courthouse steps beneath their feet. Elijah stood beside his father, tall and proud, eyes shining with quiet courage, a testament to strength forged through struggle. That night, beneath the glare of media spotlights, a father and son left the courthouse steps together, bound forever by shared purpose. The work ahead would be daunting, exhausting, and often painful, but Malcolm knew he was not alone. His son stood beside him, their community stood behind them, and now a nation watched closely, demanding true change. In the end, Malcolm's greatest victory wasn't just Elijah's freedom, nor Rourke's suspension, nor Mercer's investigation. It was this movement, this undeniable awakening that promised lasting transformation. Because for Malcolm Hayes, Elijah's case was never the end of the battle. It was merely the spark that ignited a wildfire of change, a fire fueled by justice, strengthened by truth, and destined to burn away injustice wherever it hid. And Malcolm vowed silently, standing strong beside his son, that he would never allow those flames to die. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Justice cannot and must not depend on who you are, the position you hold, or the connections you have. Malcolm Hayes' battle began as a desperate father protecting his child, but it became a powerful reminder that real justice is blind to identity, privilege, or prejudice. Elijah's freedom was won only because Malcolm had the authority and knowledge to fight, but thousands of others remain voiceless, trapped by a system that values perception over truth. True justice should not demand wealth, fame, or power. It should simply require evidence, fairness, and integrity. Malcolm's journey reveals an undeniable truth. Until every person receives equal treatment under the law, until innocence is defended as fiercely for the unknown as for the influential, justice remains incomplete. Real change will come only when society demands accountability for every person, not because of who they are, but because justice itself demands nothing less than absolute truth.